There exists a perception about comic books that they're just for kids. Or emotionally stunted man-children.
Get out of here, you stupid kid!
People believe that they're confusing to get into, overwhelming, or alienating to potential readers. Which volume do I pick up? Am I even the target audience? And mostly, there is the notion that it's all just nothing but superheroes. Listen, some of these stereotypes exist for a reason, and some of them might be painfully true, but I'm here to try and break this stigma. In this video, we're going to take a look at my personal favourite creative duo in comics, Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. And hang on, before any comics nerds jump into the comments and give me shit about my subjective favourite, just remember, you might be perpetuating some of those stereotypes.
You're like a golem with worse hair!
Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips both made their names working for the big two in American comics, Marvel and DC. And while Brubaker in particular has written two of my favourite runs on superhero comics, Captain America and Daredevil, they are both most renowned for their creator-owned works of crime fiction. I'll be delving into each of their works, including Brubaker's individual works that overlap in style, and I hope you come away from this video with the desire to pick one of them up. Welcome back to StoryTube. Now, first of all, before we actually get into the books, I know, I'm sorry, get on with it, I know, I need to give you some history. Who doesn't love a bit of history? I need to take you all the way back to the mid-1950s and the establishment of the Comics Code Authority. This was a very interesting time in comics history, and the lead up to the formation of the Comics Code was characterized by a period of moral panic in the United States. The public were concerned over the graphic violence, crime, horror elements, and mature themes present in some comics and pulp magazines, and their effects on children. This sentiment was sparked in large part by the publication of a book called The Seduction of the Innocent by German-American psychiatrist Frederick Wertham. In this book, Wertham slammed comics for their adverse effects on children's behavior, asserting that their content would increase juvenile delinquency. Senate hearings had been held, and some cities in the US had even already experienced organized book burnings and the banning of many popular and best-selling titles. The code dictated the content, tone, and inherent messaging within comics, and affected publishing houses. One example is that of EC Comics. With editor Bill Gaines at the helm, they had been publishing hugely successful comics such as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and Weird Fantasy, which was a comic featuring early artwork from famous Conan artist Frank Frazetta. Before its demise, EC Comics was well regarded for its horror fiction, crime fiction, satire, dark fantasy, and science fiction. This material dealt with mature themes. They had a level of psychological realism, and they utilized signature shock endings in their issues. Their stories were considered socially conscious and progressive for the time, dealing with issues of racial inequality, anti-war sentiment, nuclear disarmament and environmentalism, all predating the civil rights movement and counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Another example was that of Lev Gleason Publishing's Crime Does Not Pay, which was a comic that often dealt frankly with adult relationships, drug use, and sex, in addition to the frequent depictions of physical violence, torture, and murder. Both were dominant rivals to superhero comics in terms of sales, and they were influences on artists such as Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, creators of Captain America, who both published crime stories for Timely Comics, the publisher that later became Marvel. Instead of placing these comics next to adult-themed books, these companies and their comics were heavily restricted and censored by the CCA, and eventually, unable to adapt to that pressure, became defunct by 1956. The CCA prohibited the use of the terms crime or horror on comic book covers, and comics had to adopt strict moral values in their content in order to be approved. Good triumphing over evil, one-dimensional good guys versus bad guys, and certainly nothing graphically violent, untoward, or God forbid sexually suggestive. Apart from appealing to the male gaze, of course, we mustn't forget that. This adherence to the Comics Code was the means to success for Marvel Comics and Detective Comics, more commonly known as DC. And so, for roughly 30 years, mainstream American comics were dominated by censored superheroes, giving rise to the perception that comic books are nothing but superheroes. Now, This is not me saying that all superhero comics of that era are one-dimensional, or that they all lacked literary or artistic value. That couldn't be further from the truth. And it also doesn't mean that the big two didn't fight against the Comics Code Authority. Stan Lee, for example, in issues 94 to 96 of Amazing Spider-Man, had Spidey saving a young kid with a drug problem who's about to commit suicide, which wasn't approved by the Comics Code Authority. But Stan Lee subtly hid it in there anyway. Pre-code comics were also more daring in their political undertones, or overtones. But that political commentary didn't just fade away. Writers had to get more creative. But again, that is a topic for another video. Then, in the mid-1980s, something happened. The Brits invaded.
Ah, hello to you, sirs, and to you, ladies.
About 20 years after the well-known British invasion cultural phenomenon that occurred in music and counterculture in the US, the same thing happened in comics. It was a period that took the medium of comics from adolescence to adulthood, and the orchestrators of this shift were some very famous people. Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, Brian Boland, Jamie Delano, to name but a few. Many of these creators had worked for 2000 AD comics in the UK, and they brought to American comics a sensitivity of language, a maturity of storytelling, and a gradual move away from superheroes. Many of these creators worked predominantly for the newly created imprint of DC, Vertigo Comics, headed by Karen Berger, in my opinion, the savior of modern comics. This was a seismic shift in comic book storytelling and art, and with many of the most famous titles produced between 1986 and the mid-1990s. Now, this whole topic is worthy of a totally separate video, so let's focus on one particular artist. One of these young Brits was Sean Phillips, who quickly showed his talent for drawing noirish scallywags in his early work on Hellblazer for Vertigo. The character of John Constantine is a chain-smoking supernatural investigator from Liverpool, a Scouser, originally created by Alan Moore in his run on Swamp Thing. And after a stint back in the UK drawing Judge Dredd, comics of a similar tone, he returned to the US in 1999 and met his future long-term collaborator, Ed Brubaker. Brubaker had been making a name for himself, also at DC Comics, working on darker, grittier, noir-style iterations of Batman and Catwoman. And then, with artist Michael Lark, another notable figure for this duo and this video, he wrote a 4-issue miniseries called Scene of the Crime, and Sean Phillips was hired to do the ink work and colouring for Michael Lark's pencils in issues 2 to 4. This book received widespread critical acclaim in the comics community and was about to be a defining chapter for their careers. While this one isn't my favourite, and I don't rank it among their very best work, it's got all the elements that would pave the way for their 25-year partnership. The dialogue here is a little overwritten. The artwork is a little scratchy. Michael Lark and Sean Phillips complement each other well, but this pairing and this trio still hadn't found their feet. Ed Brubaker is a writer whose primary influences include the works of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Jim Thompson or George Simenon, but he also cites classic film noir cinema from the 40s and 50s, which naturally makes him very popular with us here on StoryTube, if you know our channel at all. These influences are all quite evident in the rhythm of his dialogue and his terse, almost maudlin narration style. His books have a melancholic nostalgia to them. They're all about memory and decisions, and their ripple effects and legacy. In an afterword for the first volume of the Criminal Deluxe editions, Brubaker talks about the influence of one of his favourite movies of all time, Out of the Past with Robert Mitchum. That movie's complex, fatalistic storyline, its dark cinematography, and classic femme fatale trope kind of give you a sense of the work that Brubaker and Phillips would create over the next 25 years. Born an army brat to a naval intelligence officer, Brubaker often references a turbulent adolescence, full of bad decisions.
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum.
Sean Phillips' style has evolved to fit what is demanded from him, and his influences vary from the abstract paintings of Dave McKean to the heavily shadowed artwork of Jim Bakey on 2000 AD's Skiz. As he states in an afterword for the Criminal Deluxe editions, he was also hugely inspired by the artwork of Robert McGuinness on old pulp crime paperbacks. Now, let's move on to the books, and unfortunately, my face. Let's go roughly in publication order as much as we can, because one of these series has been ongoing for almost 20 years now. But we'll go with each of the works of Brubaker and Sean Phillips roughly as they came out. And the first full collaboration they did together was Gotham Noir at DC. And it's sort of a semi-sequel to Batman Year One in a sense that is sort of an Elseworlds tale, kind of an out-of-continuity tale about Jim Gordon, the cop from Batman, if you're not familiar. And this is not great, it's fine. Again, a bit like Scene of the Crime, I kind of feel like Brubaker's dialogue here is a little overwritten. Sean Phillips' art has still yet to really come into its own. And I think sometimes the issues with these early comics by the duo is they were yet to find a balance with their inkers and the colorists that they worked with. And they fixed this later, in my opinion. However, if you don't know anything about comics, if you're working for the big two, Marvel and DC, is that a fucking cop car?
Oh my god.
That's convenient. Now, if you don't know anything about comics publishing in the US, if you're working for the big two and for a couple of other companies as well, but mainly with Marvel and DC, it's essentially all contract for hire work, and the comics that you write, then that IP does not belong to you. I'll mention something of kind of relevance and importance later when we get on to Brubaker specific books for Marvel, but like a lot of these kinds of things with the big two, there are publisher restrictions or continuity that they have to adhere to. I haven't read any of Brubaker's Catwoman or early Batman work, but I will mention another Batman book later. Gotham Noir, I don't really rate too highly. It was them kind of revving up to what they were going to do later. Now, talking about the big two publishers, DC had an imprint that was more active in the 90s and early 2000s called Wildstorm, and it was established by famous artist Jim Lee. This was kind of a shared universe, another continuity type of thing, but with a little more flexibility and freedom without all the baggage and history of superhero comics. And this was where Brubaker and Phillips did their second collaboration, a 12-issue series called Sleeper. And this was their first work of espionage. And for me, I've read only a couple issues of this run, and this was again them finding their feet. And I think Brubaker would later go on to write better espionage books later, but we'll get to that in a second. This one is in this shared Wildstorm universe, and this book isn't all that complicated. It's just espionage and supervillains and all that kind of thing set in the Wildstorm universe. I don't rank this among the very best work that this crew have done, but it's worth a read if you're a completionist. And briefly here, I want to mention as well that Ed Brubaker at this time was also co-writing a series with Greg Rucka and with art by Michael Lark. Again, we mentioned Michael Lark. For me, the style of Michael Lark and Sean Phillips, those artists really complement Ed Brubaker's style, and it's no surprise that he's worked with Michael Lark on numerous occasions as well. But they were working on a book called Gotham Central, which is essentially a police procedural series set in Gotham, all on the periphery of all the superhero action that was going on in the DC universe. We have the day shift cops and the night shift cops in Gotham, and Brubaker and Greg Rucka split responsibilities of writing the day shift and the night shift between them. Don't remember which one was which, but again, Sean Phillips didn't work on this book, but it might be worth a read if you like Ed Brubaker's writing. And Michael Lark, I feel, complements Ed Brubaker's style just as much as Sean Phillips does. And in my opinion, my favourite work by Ed Brubaker for DC, again, not a Sean Phillips collaboration, is another Batman book. And this one is called The Man Who Laughs. And this is around 2005. This was just before Ed Brubaker's departure from DC. And this book is essentially another sequel, but in continuity, to Batman Year One. Batman Year One being the famous kind of Batman first year on the job comic, written by Frank Miller. This one, Brubaker worked with artist Doug Mahnke, and they wrote the first time Batman encounters the Joker. And this one is a kind of a crime story as well. It's mainly told from the perspective of Jim Gordon, and it suits that style. And for me here, Brubaker was really coming into his own in terms of his efficiency with his dialogue and his narration, and complementing that with the art style. But in 2005, Brubaker moved to Marvel Comics. And this is where, in my opinion, we really saw Ed Brubaker's writing come into his own, and he was allowed to flourish with some creative liberty. So there's a couple of really important names here to mention with Ed Brubaker's move to Marvel Comics. He would then later request from Marvel Comics to work with Sean Phillips again, and it's gonna result in arguably their magnum opus. But first, I think there's also a couple of important names to mention here, and that would be artist Steve Epting, colorist and inker Elizabeth Breitweiser, and also one of my other favorite comic book writers, Brian Michael Bendis. Brian Michael Bendis was the hot ticket in Marvel Comics around 2000 to 2010. He was writing every single great book. The New Avengers, Ultimate Spider-Man, and my personal favorite, Daredevil. And while he was writing Daredevil, which was grounded, gritty, street-level crime, courtroom drama, psychological drama, very much of the style and tone of Brubaker Comics, albeit with a lot more dialogue, very Tarantino-esque Bendis is, Brubaker was given the Captain America job. Now this was a very interesting time for Captain America Comics. It was just post 9/11, and from 2005 to 2012, Ed Brubaker wrote what is probably widely considered the greatest Captain America run of all time. This was a grounded, nuanced, espionage-heavy political thriller where Steve Rogers didn't know who he could trust. And Ed Brubaker wrote this so well. It's my favorite run on Captain America, and it was the biggest inspiration and influence on the later MCU movies, and in particular Winter Soldier, because Ed Brubaker himself created the character of the Winter Soldier. The idea of bringing Bucky back from the dead and having him be the Winter Soldier, the former Russian agent, was a bold move, and Marvel let him do it. Marvel and DC don't tend to let you mess around with established old characters from the Golden Age, but they let him do it, and it became the most acclaimed Captain America run ever. And on this run, he predominantly worked with artist Steve Epting, another artist who I feel resembles Sean Phillips a lot, and colorist Elizabeth Breitweiser, who would go on to work with both Brubaker and Phillips on many other books. And like I mentioned, Brian Michael Bendis was writing Daredevil. He felt that Brubaker would be the natural next fit for writing Daredevil. And the two of them, as Bendis was winding down his run on Daredevil, started working back and forth together, sharing notes, going on the annual Marvel retreat, the writer's retreat, and setting up the threads for Brubaker to pick up that Daredevil story. And in my opinion, the long run between Bendis and Brubaker on Daredevil is one complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And honestly, it's my favorite era of Daredevil comics. And Brubaker wrote his portion of the Daredevil run with artist Michael Lark. And once again, it was gritty, realistic, grounded crime drama. And it was here that they worked with colorist Dave Stewart for the first time, who would go on to work on some later books. Now, like I said, Bendis and Brubaker were writing these sort of gritty, realistic crime dramas within the Marvel universe. And obviously, eventually, they're gonna have to rein it back in and pass over to the next writer and adhere to Marvel's grand plan of whatever they want to do at that time. Adhere to certain big events and crossovers and all this kind of stuff. So, while Bendis was the hottest ticket in Marvel Comics at this time, he just really wanted to write some creator-owned crime comics, and he pitched some ideas to Marvel, who then decided to create an imprint called Icon. And this imprint was a creator-owned imprint. So any IP or any comics that were pitched and published through Icon, the rights remained with the creators of those books. Bendis went off to write a book called Scarlet, among others, and Brubaker pitched a book with Sean Phillips to Marvel that will be published through Icon that is called Criminal. Criminal is this duo's magnum opus, and it was where Brubaker and Phillips' career skyrocketed, and this will be their legacy now. And they published the first volume of Criminal in 2009. The general premise of Criminal is it's a series of interconnected vignettes, mini-series, stories that often overlap in small ways, but significant ways. And it's split up into 10 volumes, all centering around regular people, deadbeats, bums, people on the periphery of crime. The series has a lot of recurring characters. Each story has a certain element of crime or element of violence, and they're stories just about people making bad decisions. Some of the most prominent recurring characters are the Lawless brothers. I think it's Ricky and Jake, and their father Teague. But there's also the unnamed city that is just as much a character in these comics, and the local dive bar called the Undertow, which is a bar with a neon sign with a missing N. It used to be called the Undertown, now it's called the Undertow, which is kind of the hive, the hub, where all these criminals and bums meet. And no crime, no deals can be done in this bar. And these books have kind of come to define this duo. Criminal is, in my opinion, their magnum opus. Some arcs in this series are better than others, but it's consistent. The 10 volumes, or the 10 arcs, are collected in individual trade paperbacks. You can read them online, or they were all published and collected in 4 deluxe editions. There was Criminal Deluxe Volume 1, 2, and 3, and Cruel Summer, being the longest of their mini-series and sort of vignette stories, was collected in its own deluxe edition and trade paperback. And they'll actually be coming back to the world of Criminal in 2025, 5 years later, with another original graphic novel called The Knives in September. And also, Criminal is soon to be a show on Amazon Prime, which I'm quite excited for because Prime have made some pretty consistent crime shows and thriller shows. Bosch, Reacher come to mind. I think Criminal would work very, very well as a TV show, given its sprawling cast of characters and kind of interconnected stories, and you see the ripple effects of decisions in one story affecting a completely different plot and other characters in other stories, and you see this theme that they have of kind of the legacy of mistakes and past mistakes and these ripple effects throughout time. Criminal is a story that spans generations and decades, and you see this lasting effect of violence and criminal behavior on all of these people, these real human beings. This was the series where Brubaker and Phillips' style really matured. It's the series that they'll be known for long after they're gone, and I would rate this at the very tip top of the work that they've done. A quick mention for the colorists and inkers as well throughout Criminal. They've worked predominantly with Val Staples and Elizabeth Breitweiser throughout the Criminal books. We don't want to forget the colorists and inkers. Sometimes they add just as much mood to the book as the writing does, or the art itself. Also, with Marvel's Icon imprint, they published a book called Incognito, which was their first real attempt at, let's say, deconstructing or breaking down the idea of vigilante violence in the superhero world. And Incognito was their own completely original story about a supervillain in witness protection who, out of sheer boredom, starts to fight crime and kind of realizes that maybe he does just like the violence, but doing some good maybe feels good too. For me, the dialogue took a little bit of a step back here. Brubaker was relying a little bit too much on feeding plot to me through dialogue rather than letting things unfold naturally in this book. It wasn't quite as smooth as Criminal. It felt like more like a good idea than brilliant execution, but honestly, it's still better than 90% of comics that I've read. It's also got some pretty kick-ass character names, like Ava Destruction and a supervillain known as the Black Death. All very pulp noir style. Incognito also had many of their classic tropes, a sort of questionable protagonist, and there were big themes of drug abuse in it, but also the idea of what is the lasting effect of violence on a person's psyche. It's not my favourite work by Brubaker and Phillips. I would probably rank it towards the bottom, but it's still worth a read if the premise sounds in any way intriguing to you. In 2012, Brubaker and Phillips decided we've had enough working for the big two and working on superhero books, and they moved to Image Comics. Now, Image Comics was set up in the 90s as an alternative to Marvel and DC, and specifically an alternative for creators to get a better deal. And Image Comics is a creator-owned publisher. I'm not going to go too deep into Image Comics, that's a whole topic for another video. But let's just say that Brubaker and Phillips got a pretty good deal here. They'd already established themselves. Brubaker had written some of the biggest selling comics, and he had just written Criminal, so he'd proved himself on some creator-owned work as well. And his contract at Marvel allowed him to take his icon titles with him, and they moved Criminal and Incognito over to Image Comics, and Image took over the publishing of Criminal after 2016. But in 2012, their first major title with Image Comics was Fatale. And I think Fatale is kind of, even more so than Criminal, the culmination of everything that Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips wanted to accomplish within comics. It is a blend of multiple genres, but it's a blend of all those genres I talked about in the beginning with the old pulp comics and magazines. This is a Lovecraftian horror noir comic set across multiple decades, but it starts off in the 50s, and the main character is a very clever play on the femme fatale trope. Josephine is a very enigmatic, mysterious woman who doesn't age and seems to have ties to the occult and maybe the devil. And there's references to the satanic panic. And we never really learn too much about Josephine. But the idea of this story is that all of the men in this series that she encounters throughout the decades are obsessed with her and feel like they can protect her, fix her, and yet she holds this psychological, supernatural power over all of them. Her mere presence causes every man she ever meets to go fucking insane. But also, there's a lot of tentacle monsters, and it's quite pulpy in that sense. So Brubaker and Phillips are really bringing back those old comics into the mainstream, into modern American comics, in a very nuanced, clever, subtly written and subtly drawn way. It's a very sexually charged series as well. Do not give this to your kids. In fact, don't give many of these books to your kids. And the colorists that worked on this series with them were Dave Stewart and Elizabeth Breitweiser, both adding a real flavour to the book. Honestly, I would put this right on par with Criminal. I think maybe artistically this is their greatest work. It combines so many of the themes and characteristics that define their work, but also it harkens back, or it revives that old era of pre-code comics for modern audiences and for adults specifically. These comics are marketed to adults. They're marketed to the right crowd. And it's also that broad range of influences that I admire as well. Noir cinema, Lovecraftian horror. It's not just a derivative piece of superhero comic based on another comic based on another comic. There's a broad range of influence here, and you can see it. And Phillips and Brubaker were just cooking on this one. It's also quite a long story, so it's 24 issues and it is one continuous story. Rather than Criminal being a series of 5 to 6 issue, 112 issue vignettes, Fatale is one complete story of 24 issues where Image kind of let the duo write as much as they want. The issues were inconsistent in their size. For Marvel and DC, you're stuck to a 22 to 24 page single issue, and then usually you'll have 5 to 6 of those single issues in one arc, and that will be in one trade paperback. And that will sort of be a chapter in itself. Fatale ran for 24 issues, but those 24 issues are very inconsistent in size, and Image let the duo just write it until it was done. With the success of Criminal and Fatale, the duo were given a unique opportunity and a historic opportunity within comics. They signed a 5-year contract with Image Comics to publish anything they wanted without any prior pitch. This was a pretty unprecedented deal within comics. It meant that Brubaker and Phillips could come up with an idea, write it, draw it, publish it without any need for prior approval or even having an editor. And the first thing that Ed Brubaker wanted to do was to bring back an idea for espionage that he had originally had while writing Captain America, and he wanted to work with that crew again. So he brought back artist Steve Epting and colorist Elizabeth Breitweiser, and took a little bit of a pause on his collaboration with Sean Phillips to write Velvet. Published in 2013, like I said, it was to recreate the tone of espionage of Cap, but this one involved a middle-aged secretary by the name of Velvet, who worked for the director of a British intelligence agency, and she herself has quite the history. In an interview with Wired magazine, Brubaker described the inception of the story, which was originally pitched as a TV show. I love the idea of flipping the typical male-oriented spy story and doing one about a woman who was also a mature, middle-aged woman. In the espionage field, it totally makes sense that someone could have a secret history. They could have had a job for 20 years that turns out to be a front, basically. But it has to be someone who's lived a real life. When he originally pitched Velvet as a TV show, many of the producers he pitched it to weren't happy with the character of Velvet's age. They wanted this character to be younger, sexier, and maybe working alongside or helping a cooler male character. Brubaker himself said, "The notes that we got from everybody were that she needed to be 25 and an agent in training learning from the cool male secret agent." I was just like, okay, this is just appalling to me. Rather than a character that had lived a real life, they wanted a woman 20 years younger, stripped of Velvet's expertise and maturity. Imagine Taken if Liam Neeson's character were 30. It's just not the same movie. But with the freedom of the contract given by Image, he didn't have to pitch this story to them. So with Image Comics, Brubaker, Steve Epting and Elizabeth Breitweiser published Velvet as a 15-issue sort of maxi series. And this one is really good. This one I would put maybe below their best, but above the bottom to middle. It's just solid. Everything that Brubaker writes is pretty solid in my opinion. And this is well worth a read, especially since it plays with tropes and conventions and expectations of the espionage genre. Another benefit of this no-pitch deal that they had with Image allowed Brubaker and Phillips to write this next book. Between 2014 and 2016, they published a book that many other publishers would have thought would be pretty boring. And that was The Fade Out, a historical period noir piece about Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s. So before telling you exactly what The Fade Out is about, here's a fun little fact about Ed Brubaker. His uncle was John Paxton, well-regarded Hollywood noir screenwriter, and The Fade Out is inspired by many events that may or may not have happened to or around John Paxton during his life. Heavily fictionalized, but there is a realism to this book, an authenticity to it that feels like stories that were told to Brubaker in his adolescence. And The Fade Out tells the story of a struggling Hollywood screenwriter with PTSD. He's got writer's block, and his best friend is one of the blacklisted screenwriters during the Red Scare. Those screenwriters who were blacklisted for potential links to communism. The main character and his best friend try to write scripts together, get them sold, and work is just beginning on their latest movie when our main character wakes up with no memory of the night before in the house of one of the largest producers, and the main female lead, the star of his movie, is found dead in the living room. And thus begins this sort of underbelly, seedy, smoky, cigar-filled story of Hollywood covering shit up. It is very sexy. It's very cool. It's very sexy. I find that the characters are sometimes a little bit hard to keep track of here because there's a lot going on. It's quite a complex story, even only for 12 issues. But this is also quintessential Brubaker Phillips. It is also about a very interesting time. Fair if you don't like books about writers, this is probably not going to be for you. There's a lot of inner turmoil about being a writer in it. But this one is quite near the top of the work that they've done. And if the premise at all intrigues you, it delivers exactly what you would want it to. With the conclusion of the Fade Out, they then moved on to one of my absolute favourite books by this crew, and that is Killer Be Killed. And a bit like Fatale, this is one longer form story, about 20-25 issues, and it was published between 2017 and 2018. Back doing the colours for Killer Be Killed was Elizabeth Breitweiser as well. I think she's one of my favourites, maybe aside from the latest collaborator that the duo have that I'll mention in a little bit. But Elizabeth Breitweiser's colours just add such an atmosphere to these books. She also adds an element of range to Sean Phillips' art, which can sometimes feel a little bit samey. I just want to give out a shout out to Elizabeth Breitweiser here, because sometimes inkers and colorists really get overlooked. Killer Be Killed is about a young art student who's kind of disillusioned with the world and is on the precipice of committing suicide when the devil stops him. And he makes a deal with this devil. For every bad person that he goes out and kills, the devil will let him live one more month. But this is one of my absolute favorites. I think this one is what they tried to do with Sleeper and Incognito. This look at vigilante violence, but this time they were ready to write it. And this story was really, really good. You get right into the depth and the psychology of this character, and the length of the story really lets the plot and the character study kind of simmer and settle, and they really get to examine the consequences of what vigilante violence would really look like. Even though there's a supernatural element to it, this is a really grounded book. It's an interesting book just in terms of comics, seeing that vigilante violence is essentially 90% of the comic book publishing industry. Killer Be Killed for me ranks just on par with Fatale and Criminal. It might not be quite as good as those, but again, it's been quite a few years since I've read it. But for me, in terms of what they accomplished with this story, this is among their really very, very best. We enter now the last kind of 5 years of this creative duo. And this is their period of graphic novels, of original graphic novels. But hang on, haven't we been talking about graphic novels this whole time? No, we haven't really. These guys, up until this point, had been writing exclusively comic book series. The essential difference between comics and graphic novels are the comics are those published in those floppy little 20-page single issues, and then we generally refer to the graphic novel as when those single issues are collected and published in either one collection or multiple little collections, which is technically not a graphic novel, but it works. That's what the term means now. But in 2020, Brubaker and Phillips decided they wanted to tell kind of more fleshed out stories without any cuts or breaks in between, without sort of these kind of chapters. And they had just re-upped the contract with Image to publish whatever they want without having to pitch it. So they started publishing exclusively graphic novels, original graphic novels of varying length. And this all started with the publication of still one of my favorites, Pulp. Pulp, unfortunately, is another book about a writer, but this is a pulp writer, a writer of old comic strip magazines and pulp magazines, old westerns in the 40s and 50s. And this pulp writer gets dragged into a pulp story of his own. There's western elements, there's people punching Nazis, and it's all very tongue-in-cheek, kind of a sense of humor, but it's also got that melancholic tone that I really love in Brubaker Phillips books. And this one I'd put maybe just under the very best work, because my only issue with this book is that I wanted more of it. It was an 80-page graphic novel, and I wanted it to be 200 pages. And something pretty cool happened when they worked on Pulp. Sean Phillips' son, Jacob Phillips, became the inker and colorist for his dad's art. And since this duo have just been working with Jacob Phillips, and honestly, along with Elizabeth Breitweiser, Jacob Phillips I think is the best colorist they've ever worked with. And some of his work has been unbelievable on these graphic novels that they've published in the last few years. Then, just after Pulp, they published the first of 5 Reckless books about Ethan Reckless. Ethan Reckless is a Hollywood fixer, private investigator, kind of a person who can do it all, get things done for you. This is 70s LA Noir, 70s, 80s LA Noir, and between 2020 and 2022, they published 5 of these graphic novels, each one being about 200 pages or 220 pages. So they're quite meaty, substantial stories. And I really like the first 2, maybe, the first 3, and then it felt a little repetitive. I think that maybe it could be a case that if you read one of these a year for 5 years, they're perfect. I read them kind of all back to back and they got a little samey and a little repetitive. And to be fair, talking about all of these books together, they can all feel a little samey, a little repetitive, but writers and artists tend to have a certain style or theme that they keep coming back to and examining in slightly different ways. But if you read them back to back, they can feel a little samey. And to me, the Reckless books feel a little derivative of each other. While I still think this stuff is really solid and probably up there, it's not quite the best stuff that they've written. They're not the deepest books that they've written either. Some of the characters are a little surface level. But if you like stuff like Richard Stark's Parker novels, if you like Jack Reacher, if you like Bosch, Lincoln Lawyer, these kinds of stories, the Reckless books will really do it for you as well. I would just suggest to read them spaced out. And a very fun fact about the Reckless books, brief interlude in talking about these books. Remember when I said that Ed Brubaker created the character of the Winter Soldier? Well, at the premiere of the Winter Soldier movie, Ed Brubaker and Sebastian Stan became quite good friends. And Sebastian Stan may or may not have felt that Ed Brubaker should have gotten more credit, or more importantly, more money, for the creation of the Winter Soldier character. So Sebastian Stan has been working tirelessly for the last few years to get an adaptation going of one of Brubaker and Phillips' books. And he settled on adapting the Reckless books, which in my opinion would make for a great series of movies. I believe that is moving ahead or is in development. I'll believe that this is happening once I'm sitting down in the cinema to watch a Reckless movie with Sebastian Stan. But it's just kind of funny and ironic that the Winter Soldier himself might star as Ethan Reckless in a potential Reckless movie. Anyway, now the last 3 books I kind of want to mention in one little batch because they're the most recent works of Brubaker and Phillips. And those are 3 original graphic novels that they've published between 2023 and most recently in 2024. Night Fever, Where the Body Was, and Houses of the Unholy. Full disclaimer, I have yet to read Houses of the Unholy, but Night Fever and Where the Body Was are 2 of my favourite things that Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips have written, and it excites me to no end that 2 of my favourite things that they've written have been published in the last 18 months. Night Fever I can only describe as a Brubaker Phillips take on Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut meets George Simenon's The Man Who Watched Trains Go By. It's a cool little book. It's not about a writer, it's about a publishing agent. A bored, middle-aged publishing agent who goes off to a conference in Paris away from his family, and he gets pulled into a world of wealthy depravity, and he puts on a mask. Maybe at the beginning quite literally, but metaphorically puts on a mask and becomes somebody else. Lets loose a little bit. Breaks bad, shall we say, just to see what a little bit of spice in his life might look like. And this book is like a dreamy, surreal trip full of LSD. And honestly, this is the best work that Jacob Phillips has done. Jacob Phillips is unbelievable. The star of this book, not only the writing and kind of the ambiguity of the book and the depth of it and the sort of efficiency with the writing, but it's Jacob Phillips' colouring. It's so beautiful. This is a wonderful book, and it is just long enough. Nothing here goes to waste and nothing is overwritten, and the colours add an atmosphere and a tone to this that is sort of unlike anything they've done before. And this is one of my absolute standout favourites. I'd put this up there with Criminal, Fatale and Kill or Be Killed. And after that we have Where the Body Was, which is also one of my favourites, and I would also put it right up there, mainly because it feels slightly different to everything they've done before while still maintaining everything about the fundamentals that makes their work so good. Where the Body Was is kind of a puzzle box mystery where it's all about the characters. And this is set on one street in suburban America, a fictional street in suburban America with about 8 characters from different houses that kind of all have their version or their perspective on a certain event, on a murder maybe, is it a murder? And all of their lives intertwine, overlap, their stories interconnect. What is the truth? Does it really matter? And is everybody just too much in everybody else's shit? This is a great little graphic novel. Honestly, the sheer quality of these last 2 graphic novels that I've read make it a bit of a shame that I have yet to read Houses of the Unholy. But the only reason I've yet to read Houses of the Unholy is that it sounds a little too similar to Fatale. So I might give it a little while before I read this one. This one is all about satanic cults again, and coming back to that idea of the satanic panic. It's about an FBI agent who's investigating cult crime sects, and also a woman with a past linked to the satanic panic, and both of them get together and try to hunt down a serial killer. It sounds fun, I'm sure it's solid, and I'll recommend it anyway, because everything they write is consistently good. So, that's it. That's everything that they've written. I've read just about everything. I could recommend just about everything. Brubaker and Phillips might not be the most original writers to ever grace the artistic world, the publishing world, the comic book world. They maybe haven't published any super original stories, apart from maybe Fatale, but their work is, in my opinion, historically, culturally, and contextually very, very interesting. The writing is always really sharp. The art is always really moody and atmospheric. The colorists they work with add such a flavour to their books. Their endings are often ambiguous and sometimes anticlimactic, and the odd time kind of unsatisfying, but they always leave you with the sense that they've just said something. And the endings are often pretty tragic. Their work resurrects a bygone era of artistic expression, updating it for modern sensibilities. They write mature, sophisticated comics for adult readers, which, thinking back to the era of the British invasion in comics and this kind of move to mature comics, that period also led to some comics being overly graphic and overly violent and overly explicit and profane, to the point of themselves being immature and kind of juvenile just because they could say fuck 15 times in one sentence. I think Brubaker and Phillips have brought a balance to adult comics. They've brought a kind of tonal maturity and a subtlety to adult comics in the 21st century, which has kind of swung the pendulum back to a more balanced reading experience, full of ideas about what it means to be human and what capacity do we have for doing bad things and making bad decisions. And how do we make sense of this difficult world? But ultimately, these comics are just consistently a great fucking time. So thanks for watching, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you next time.